Welcome to the Under the Hat podcast, the show where we talk about everything and anything that is top of mind in education. The goal is to provide meaningful conversation to what is currently happening in our classrooms. Stories, pains, moments of success. We want to hear it all. Welcome, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Under the Hat podcast. Super stoked to be back. I know that it's been a minute. I've been super busy with conferences and stuff like that. In fact, I'm headed to another one in Palm Springs tomorrow. So you'll have a little bit of absence from Under the Hat until we get to next week. Next week, we have, I believe, 2 guests lined up. But today, super stoked. So today's an example of, you have a podcast, you're in ed tech, you're consulting, presenting, and you meet people from all over. But this is a good example of there are stars in your backyard. And so my good friend Lindsey Bird here is an example of that. I'm a big fan of the work that she has done in education, has a lot of years under her belt, a lot of knowledge. And anytime there's a meaningful, amount of work done in a particular area, there's a meaning and really power behind that message. And that, to me, I believe is something that, Lindsey, you bring to the table. So super excited. So first of all, how are you this afternoon?
I'm doing well, enjoying this lovely spring weather as I look out my window and wish I was outside basking in it, but soon.
Yeah. And just a little bit of context for those that are listening from, and feel free to drop stuff in the chat or whether it's on Instagram or on YouTube. So Lindsey and I were both in the Central Valley of California. And out of nowhere, it just got warm, right? It was really cold. I was wearing the jackets and stuff. And I felt like starting yesterday, it got quite warm. So I'm excited to enjoy that weather once that time comes. And so, Lindsey, I know that a lot of people are jumping in. I'm seeing them jump in here. So for those that perhaps have not met you, have not seen your work, whether it's on social or elsewhere, a little bit of context about the work that you've done in education and kind of what you're currently working on.
That sounds great. Well, thank you for having me. I enjoy the opportunity to talk about my professional purpose and passion, which I found, like you said, here in the heart of the Central Valley, born and raised in Modesto. And I think, like many, swore once I got the opportunity to leave for college, I'd never be back. And here I am, and am really passionate about trying to be, part of the solution for the problems that I saw growing up, which led me to teaching social science by credential, but out of, I would say, fate, because I think it was luck. I was assigned the English learner sections when I started teaching in high school, when I returned to my hometown. And fast forward a few years, I was fortunate enough to be on a committee where we just really disaggregated the data, because the demographic that the state calls English learner, or, sometimes we refer to, multilingual learners, is so diverse. And by no means is there a one size fits all approach to meaningful access. So we were able to create a pathway for rigor and access for long-term English learners. At the time, we internally in the school district defined that as students who'd been in our school system for 5 years or more. And then I was privileged to be one of the founding teachers and the coordinator and the classroom social science teacher for the newcomer pathway we created, which was referred to as the Language Institute. So that's where I feel like I really transitioned from, educator to educator advocate, because in order to serve the needs of those students in an equitable fashion, it's not just creating new pathways in terms of curriculum, master schedule design, teaching strategies. It's having to also uncover and address some local and state policy barriers that were by no means written with the specific intention to create a barrier for this demographic of students, but were barriers nonetheless. And so really diving into what that looks like in terms of making change at the local and even the state level. So that's the work. I left the classroom in 2020 when the newcomer high school program, which we created and had been wildly successful for about a decade, was reimagined and watered down to the point where I didn't feel it was going to, bring the students the promise that we had worked so hard towards. So I did leave the classroom, and now I work for a nonprofit. I work for Teach Plus California. I run what's called the Emergent Bilingual Change Agent Network. So I'm coaching teachers from across California, anchored in the policy called the EL Roadmap, bringing that to life in the local context in different cities and counties and communities throughout the state, which has really made all of the trials and the tribulations and the struggles I went through as an advocate here. It's like given that some purpose, because I literally, as I'm coaching these teachers, have been there and able to apply that real life in the trenches experience in getting them to address some of the culture change and the systemic barriers that we need to address. We need to have some real courageous conversations if we're going to bring emergent bilingual students of all different typologies the equity that they deserve. And so that's what I do now, in addition to some of the policies that we still have identified at the state level that could also bring the funding and the support educators need to bring that to life.
Yeah. And I mean, if you're a teacher, especially in our state, right, especially in our area, like Central Valley, it's the English language students that we support. It's such an important part of what we do, because like you said, like it's not a one size fits all, but sometimes, I don't know, like when I like now working in a credential program, it not to like the professor's fault, I don't think, but like more of just like how this all gets funneled down in terms of how we prepare student teachers,
yes,
how we train teachers, right? How we like when you go into professional development or professional learning of any kind around this area, it's almost like, oh, it's easy. You just do this, this, and this. And it reminds me a lot of like, as a teacher myself, like where I get frustrated with box curriculum. It's kind of that same problem, that same kind of idea that like, hey, all you got to do is put all of what you're doing in this little box and it's just going to work, right? Just because I said so, or like, we have to take their word for it. So because you kind of talked about like, stuff like barriers we have to overcome. Are you able to speak of any examples or anything more specific as to like something that we need to address, maybe like at the legislative level, local legislative level, but also like what can we do as teachers that are trying to do our best meeting the needs of all of our students?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I can speak to both. I can give you some examples of a barrier, and also there's even a few bills that are, in the process, hopefully, of being voted on and adopted that I could give shout outs to in terms of providing the support from the state. So the first is the story. I think that what made me a big advocate of not just, doing my best to deliver the content and the language acquisition in the classroom, but like looking at how we could do better by students from like more of a systems angle, whether that be at the district or at the state, had to do with my first teaching assignment. Like I said, when I believe it was a total blessing to have been assigned the English learner sections, and knowing right away that I had students that didn't even know that they were labeled English learner. They were born here. They had been in our school district since kindergarten, were very confused why they were there, certainly had no idea how to reclassify. And then in the very same class, I was teaching students that had just arrived, didn't even have enough English to be able to ask to use the restroom. So to me, that was like a heads up literally from day one, that like the idea of the one size fits all, just because they had that common indicator in the computer system of EL for English learner, like that's not where it's at. So to get more granular, fast forward to when I'm doing, the newcomer program, and our system, especially our high school system, it's very much designed around the factory system. You get on that conveyor belt of what a freshman should take or what a sophomore should take, and it's really challenging when you have students that can't plug into that conveyor belt, right? So for example, one of the things that we did in the newcomer program that we tried to get implemented into policy unsuccessfully, unfortunately. But that doesn't mean that others can't do a version of this, because the good news about education is it's local control. So it's a political process, and the EO roadmap and all the policies on paper in Sacramento give us the tools to meet our communities where they're at. So, for example, when you have students who are entering U.S. schools, we refer to them as SLIFE, students with limited and interrupted formal education. So not only are they learning English as a second language, but maybe they've been in a refugee camp and they have not been to school for 5, 6, 7 years. I had some extreme cases where students had literally never had formal education, and all the trauma that goes with the situation that brought them here to the United States. Those students, in many cases, did not know the Roman alphabet, which is a challenge to that conveyor belt factory system, right? Because what our system does is teaches students how to read. It teaches literacy from preschool through 3rd grade. And then it kind of flips. And from 4th grade and beyond, there's an assumption that students can read with, comprehension. And then students are reading to learn. So what happens when a student comes to the United States and they can't read to learn? In fact, they don't even know the alphabet. I mean, I know, I have a master's degree, and if I were to try to take what I feel like I have expertise in and articulate it in China or in Iraq, in languages that use other characters, I would have to learn the alphabet first, right? So even though that's like really disconnected with what we associate with being taught at the high school level, it's still just a natural stepping stone for language acquisition, especially when you consider students with gaps in education. So we had to rethink that systemic barrier of just putting a student in biology because they're a sophomore, right? Like, do we have to put those students in a class at a certain grade level based on their age, or can we create foundational classes that give them the language they need, and sometimes, occasionally, accelerate their content knowledge because they haven't had the benefit of going to school? And can we accelerate that and get them into grade level content courses as quickly and as often as possible, but provide that foundation first without just putting a student that doesn't know the Roman alphabet into a grade level course because that's what sophomores take.
Right. Yeah. No. And that, again, kind of like going back to like what I said before, like this boxed in mentality. I remember, way back when, like myself being in a credential program, be like, oh, just use some sentence frames. Right. It'll be good. But like in hindsight, like looking back at that, like in what you're speaking about now is like, it's much more bigger than that, right? Like if you look at like the language barrier aside, what brought him here, or perhaps the culture shock, or the just, the different, just, I guess, even the trauma, I guess, of just being somewhere different, right? Being somewhere else. And so you're right. Like just putting a student in, like, let's say a biology class because of that grade level or their age, like it's almost like too much of what's on paper and not much about the practicality and the reality of what they're going through. And I do know that, Lindsey, like you did do a lot of work with, developing an institute, which kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, but felt like a school within a school.
Exactly. Yeah. All the newcomers that were in U.S. schools 3 years or less were bused to one high school. And so we had strength in numbers because we were able to build a master schedule to accommodate their need. But it was a school within this school because they could access the master schedule, the mainstream. So we could have a student that was in like the beginning phases of language acquisition and taking AP calculus at the same time. So it was really beautiful because it gave the support that the students need without the sacrifice of the rigor, which has too often been the case traditionally, is like the bigotry of low expectations, like the assumption that newcomers, when they're learning the language, shouldn't or can't have access to grade level curriculum. English is not a measure of intelligence or potential, right? So two things can be possible at the same time. A student could be at the beginning phases of learning the language and still have great assets and potential in other classes. And so that was the beauty of being that school within the school, like you described, is because you didn't have to hold students back when they were excelling in certain areas.
Yeah. So because what exactly did that look like too? Like, I mean, I'm just asking because while people are listening, like they're probably seeing a need for some sort of solution in their own areas, right? Um, if you have a group of students that are in one location, like are they all in the same room? How many teachers are involved? Like what's the what was the structure, particularly with what you saw as measures of success?
Yeah, good question. So like I said, totally atypical of the typical, high school setting. What we did is we created 4 tiers. So rather than saying, ninth through 12th grade, tier 1 would be the student that arrives at the very beginning phases of acquiring English and possibly has some gaps in formal education. Whereas the tier 4 student would be in a majority mainstream schedule. Maybe they just still had ELD to support their language development, but the rest of their classes were mainstream. And then in addition to having those 4 tiers, and we'd give, enrollment assessment, so that by no means would a student have to start at tier 1. If they could, start at tier 3 or tier 4, then that was fabulous. We were able to create like a customized schedule for each student. And like I said, it wasn't a cookie cutter in the sense that in the tier where you landed, you could take the tier 2 for your ELD, but still be able to go to mainstream classes and other subject areas. That being said, the most, I think, prescriptive and I would argue vital of the 4 tiers was the tier 1 offerings, because again, the tier 1 student, regardless of their age, so as long as they were, basically 13 to 19 years old, that window by which students are high school students, if they tested into that tier 1 foundational level, like I said, our model was acceleration, not remediation, because these kids have assets, right? We're accelerating them toward grade level. So we created a tier 1 schedule that was more than just the legal mandate of ELD. So they had a double block of ELD. I taught the social science class that was rooted in language acquisition and academic writing. We had foundations of math that helped accelerate students toward grade level, and knowing that they're going to have to pass, in our school, there were certain math courses you had to pass in order to graduate. I know those exist throughout the state. So if the students haven't been exposed to that, we needed to accelerate them toward that. We had a class called acculturation, which was more everyday language. The students really enjoyed. It was a wonderful opportunity to develop competence in, their fluency and in public speaking, while using the words that they needed in the community or to discover the goals they were setting. And then I'm also, my program was, and as an advocate, I'm also a real big proponent of bilingualism. The idea that if a student has literacy in their primary language, that's going to transfer over and actually make language acquisition easier. We have data throughout the state and the country that says students who are, reclassified English proficient and are biliterate in 2 languages actually outscore and outperform English only native speaking students. So with that spirit, we had our Spanish speakers enroll in Spanish for Spanish speakers so they could simultaneously develop their literacy in Spanish while developing English. Sometimes that went against the grain, right? Some of them were like, hey, I'm here for English. I don't want that. So we would tell them the philosophy, and we had an absolutely phenomenal teacher for that course. I have to brag on her. If she ever hears that this podcast, she'll be mad. But I mean, how many teachers do you know that for 20 years straight have had a 100% pass rate on their AP exam, right? I know. And I remember her being celebrated in the back to school staff meeting once by our principal, and someone under their breath was like, well, of course they all got 100%. They all already speak Spanish. And he replied, well, by that logic, then we should have 100% in all of our AP English courses, shouldn't we? And it was like silence, right? Because our culture so values English as the dominant language that sometimes we only see success when it happens under the vehicle of English. And so I'm really proud of her as a teacher future and of our students, but just in general, bilingualism is really like the key to the future. Unfortunately, we had so much linguistic diversity, we weren't able to offer, like Arabic for Arabic speakers or Vietnamese for Vietnamese speakers, but the philosophy and the culture of always be able to read, write, and speak with fluency your native language and English, it was something that we really promoted in our program. So that's what I would argue was like the secret, was to be able to receive students of a variety of educational backgrounds, different literacy levels in their own language without literacy in English, and create these on-ramps to where they could plug into that traditional mainstream high school schedule as quickly as possible. And also just knowing that like we promoted higher education. We were very proud of not only our graduation rates, but the percentage of our students that graduated going on to higher education. It was about 85%. But we also know that like you don't have to go to college in order to have a meaningful career and be a contributing member of society. So the philosophy was just like every student should leave the public school system with a high school diploma and the literacy, the numeracy, and the self-efficacy, the confidence to just pursue all options on the table. And so for some students, that meant that they weren't necessarily going off to higher education, but we knew that they could navigate as long as they left our program with those skills.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack with this work, right? Like, and so like the first, and I'm gonna do just spoiler alert, I'm gonna do a lot of local shout outs right now, because and Lindsey, like you've been a powerhouse in our area for this type of work, but there's also like there's other schools, there's other educators in our area that are just as passionate about this as you, right? So like when you talk about, and I can't say it exactly how you did, but like this idea that, as we, at least in our country, in our education system, a lot of times we're like, okay, you're an English language learner, so we're going to take the pathway of almost burying underground your native language, which kind of is like in the same time like their own culture and who they are. And I've seen this recently. So shout out to Turlock Unified. They allow me to teach at their Turlock Adult School. Lovely job. Like teaching at an adult school is like just the jam. But we have a very diverse community in Turlock, therefore I have a diverse classroom. And so I've experienced that from our adult learners, where I give them the option of like, hey, here's this document, I'll translate it in English, Spanish, and a few other languages that I know exist in the room. And it's almost like they sometimes it's like they're shamed, like they're like, oh no, I have to try it in English. And I'm like, okay, you absolutely can. But you can also feel comfortable and thrive and show that thinking, show that literacy, show that confidence, right, in a language that makes sense for this current moment. And to me, and maybe I'm wrong, like that's a product of like what gets fed to them at a certain level, like of just like, hey, we have to bury, in order to be proficient in school here, you have to bury this thing that is a big part of who they are, right? And so like, shout out to the Turlock Adult School. They will get tagged in some way at the end of this. But the other thing too is like seeing like, and I know there's been a lot of research in this of like the power of being bilingual, right? Why do we have to call it reclassification, or why do we have to have this long, like intimidating word for it, when really what hopefully what they want to accomplish is like, I want to just know 2 languages. And shout out to the Riverbank Language Academy. That's a school that has my heart. My daughter goes to that school. She's in 1st grade, and I knew that it was going to be good for her, but you don't know how good until you actually see it from your own child or from someone that you're close with. Because like the fact that she's like reading English and Spanish just as proficiently, she's speaking like she can, and I can see how her wheels turn differently than how mine did when I was her age, as I only speak English, right? And so just seeing the benefits of communication, of the metacognition of it, the understanding of syntax, like the list goes on, right? Of like all the benefits. But why at least in our area, how many dual immersion schools do we actually have, right?
Not enough.
And not enough, right? And so like there's like all these benefits, and so I just want to do those shout outs because there are some, you know, educators, and I mentioned schools in our area that are like, that understand that calling, that understand the value of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, no, everything you said, it resonates so much. And I do think it is important to like give credit where credit is due. So I'm so glad, that you named Turlock and Riverbank. And I know that, that's one of the things I like about coaching is being able to elevate bright spots, because sometimes when you look at data that shows opportunity gaps as a teacher, it can be really defeating and depressing, right? So we need to like highlight, where there is success. But also just like culturally speaking, like you said, having adult students who are like reluctant to plug into their primary language because they've really been told that like their full value is like predicated on their ability to express their intelligence in English, right? I mean, obviously, mastery of English is like the key that opens doors of opportunity. So by no means, is it that we're not encouraging, full proficiency in English. It's both, right? And so I mentioned the California English Learner Roadmap because it's this like, North Star of the mindsets and the environment and the inclusive spaces that you need to embrace multicultural, multilingual students. And really, if you were to do like principle one of the EL roadmap, it would make all demographics of students feel welcome and safe. So in that regard, it's a thing of beauty because it's not specific to one demographic. It was adopted policy in 2017, yet the work I'm doing now, what we found, I'm currently recruiting for the 4th cohort of the Emergent Bilingual Change Agent Network. And one of the very first things we ask the teachers throughout the state to do is to like poll their colleagues about their awareness of this beautiful policy that exists in Sacramento. And like 80% of them have never even heard of it. So, our part of my work now, and what I'm always saying is like, what good do fancy words on paper in Sacramento do students if it's not bringing equity and access to them in the classroom? So our theory of action is like through teacher leadership, we can help do exactly that. But we have to, as a state, we also have to like simultaneously be super proud that we have this policy that is the envy of other states that are trying to meet the diverse needs of multilingual students. But we can't also escape our history and our past. So when I was a high school student here at Downey High School in Modesto in the mid-90s, one of the things that really got me interested in advocacy and like I said, wanting to come back and be part of the solution was a lot of propositions that were on the ballot in the mid to late 90s that were quite honestly very racist and very targeted toward the Mexican immigrant community and Spanish speakers in particular. One proposition that was passed and did pass the court's test, so it became the law of the land, was called Prop 227, which said that English only instruction was now the law. It dismantled all bilingual and dual immersion programs with very few exceptions with waivers. It said that students that were brand new to the country or new to English were only allowed to be provided like support through ELD for up to 12 months. So it was very contrary to the philosophy that we're talking about today. Luckily, for your daughter's sake, Prop 58 passed in 2016, which again, reversed Prop 227, got rid of the whole 12-month rule, gave the state the ability and funding sources for dual immersion programs. So great. But here's the problem. The mentality, the mindsets, the people who voted for Prop 227 back in 1997, 98, they're still in our school system. They're still in our community. That legacy of how people think, like, I think, what does the saying go? Culture eats policy for breakfast. And I think that the EO roadmap is like a perfect example of that. Is we have to at a community level have conversations about how we see assets in people and how we value them. And it's like when we can agree that bilingualism is a huge asset, it's a superpower. Our Secretary of Education at the federal level right now is very proud to be multilingual, and he tells everyone he thinks that being bilingual in English and Spanish is his superpower. I agree with him, right? And so we need to almost like change how we think about students before we can get the curriculum and the strategies to meet their needs. Because you can have all, like you said, the packaged curriculum and all the best books and all the tools as a teacher. But if you're sitting there like not valuing who they are, or only seeing their value in conformity to the culture, and they're only considered worthy of praise when they master English, then that deficit lens, like the words my students used to say when they had the English to like talk about how they first felt when they came to the United States, was they would say, I could feel it in my bones. I could feel it without even being able to converse with the teacher, if they thought that I was capable, if they saw value in me. And so those are like the courageous conversations that I think we need to have in all communities, but particularly in the Central Valley. Like, how do we value students, and how do we overcome some of the mindsets and the legacies of the propositions from the late 90s, so that we can really start to think about our students in an asset-minded way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like, and again, like the longer we have this conversation, like the deeper we go down in that rabbit hole of like, it's not fixing one thing. Like, it's not fixing one, oh, we just got to pivot this and boom, it'll be fixed. Right. And
Right.
These are the kind of problems that create a lot of brainstorming, a lot of collaboration, a lot of empathy. Right. And so if you are an educator right now and you feel deeply about this issue, what do you do? Where do you go? And because like part of it is like, well, I want to learn how to be better in my own classroom. But then the other part of it is like, I want to be better for my own PLC, my own department, my own community. Like, what steps could be made to be a part of the solution at this point, if you're more like the grassroots area of, hey, I'm in the trenches with my students, what do they do?
Well, the first thought that comes to head just to my mind, because it's the work I do all day, every day, is because we do have applications open right now for the Emergent Bilingual Change Agent Network. If there's any teacher in California right now, preschool through 12th grade, that wants to do exactly what you just mentioned, they can go to teachplus.org/CA for California, or just click on California once you go to the teachplus.org website and apply. Because what we do is we actually get money from philanthropy. So we pay our teachers stipends, and we coach them and give them professional development and community of practice spaces outside of their contractual duties, in order to do the work you mentioned. And we do have the teachers that apply and are accepted not only get permission from their administrator, but also make sure that they align their change effort to something that's already happening either at the site or the district level, because we don't want teachers, swimming upstream and not being, celebrated and helped in their change effort. We want to make sure that they're advancing the efforts of the school community. But at the same time, we know that, administrators have a lot on their plate. They have a lot going on. And so what we're trying to do is to provide the support, some of the current policies that need to be implemented, like the EL roadmap and a few other recent bills that have passed that could really help like bring knowledge to people, but also have those courageous conversations, like I said, that challenge some of the mindsets that get in the way, at like the interpersonal level. Like, teachers need support and encouragement and engaging in that, because, leader, you don't have to like be a principal to be considered a leader, right? Like, teachers are leaders every single day. And I think that like the staff culture and changing that, I think, is best grassroots, like you mentioned. I don't know if you remember like going to professional developments and getting all excited, and then like you kind of just go back to what you've been doing all along 2 days later. Or sometimes you get that external expert to come in and give an inspiring talk. And it's all great. Like that should continue to happen. But at the same time, investing in teacher leaders to where there's like that continuity, to where the conversation is every day at the lunch table or in the PLC meetings, it's like sustainable. So that's the work we're doing. The applications for that network are open through Monday, April 8th. People can apply directly, teachers can, or if you're listening and you're like, you know what, that's not my lane of advocacy, but I feel like every school and every community has that multilingual champion. You can also get on the website and nominate a teacher so that they know about it to help spread the word. There's also other, professional organizations. For example, I'm an advisor for the California Newcomer Network. We do quarterly Zooms and bring in experts and, share information and best practices via Zoom. We just recently created a national newcomer network, again, trying to, share best practices from like a national lens. So those are just a few examples of professional organizations where teachers can like plug in and get support and not feel alone, and be held up by other people throughout the state that are doing the work. At the end of the day, I would just really encourage any teacher that's hearing this to look at the California English Learner Roadmap and to like align whatever it is that you're asking and advocating for to the words in it. Because when teachers ask for change, if it's just an opinion or it's what you've observed, sometimes it can be easily dismissed. But when we can align it to state policy that has existed for over 5 years, that hasn't come to life now, it'll really give like credence to what it is you're asking for. So if you can go to the EL roadmap and think about, if I could make a change effort that I think would make my students' situation better for them, it would make teachers feel more supported and empowered, kind of pressure test your idea by looking at the EL roadmap and thinking well, where does it sit? Where does it fit in? I guarantee you'll find it. And then you could use those words to help advocate at your school site or in your district, because then it's not just your opinion as a teacher, but it's actual policy you're trying to bring to life.
Yeah. And that's such a good point that you made earlier about the roadmap of it just not being known,
Right.
which is kind of wild. Right. And I admittedly am part of that. I think you mentioned 80%, right? Where in our district that you and I both have taught in, I don't remember it ever being mentioned. And I know that our district isn't the only ones that are in that category that are in that boat. So there's no disrespect or shade. But I do appreciate that you mentioned the teacherplus.org. Hopefully I got it right here. And hopefully I grabbed the right one.
Yep, that looks right from here.
And that'll be in the show notes. I think that'll be really good for people to view and access. I also think it's worth sharing your own website. So lindseybirdconsulting.com I was poking around being nosy earlier before we hopped on to kind of did my prep for this episode. A lot of good stuff on it. You have a blog. It looks like, you do provide services of your own for what I'm assuming is district or even school-wide levels. I don't know if you wouldn't mind speaking to that and kind of what you're doing with your site.
Yeah. So the first thing I did as a consultant was actually advise a textbook publishing company, because especially when it comes to the beginning language acquisition and the SLIFE profile I mentioned before, all the curriculum that met students at that foundational literacy need tended to have clowns and balloons, because we just assumed it was happening at the primary grades, right? So I worked with Hoot and Mifflin to figure out, how could you bring that acceleration of language acquisition to a high school student that isn't insulting to their chronological age. So that was a really fun project that was really born from the work that I did in the classroom. I've also done some really specific cultural competency trainings, like, for example, when the Taliban took over in Kabul, it was pretty evident, from the TV screens that large numbers of Afghan students were going to be coming into U.S. schools throughout the country. So with a Teach Plus teacher leader in Sacramento who happens to be Afghan American. So she and I, coupled up with her lived experience as an Afghan American in the US school system, and then my experience as a teacher. We created some really specific cultural competence, cultural humility, facts about refugee resettlement for schools. So, little things like that. Sometimes, it's when you have a student demographic that's in your community where, because they're so new, there aren't like the community elders, right? So for example, when I was working, for Modesto City Schools, I was calling El Concilio all the time because they had, these deep community roots. We had, Spanish speaking leaders where I could plug into existing resources. I could ask people to come be role model, guest speakers for my students. If that doesn't exist for a new demographic, I feel like that's a real opportunity, that a space that I like to fill, to like try to, figure out how we can support students when maybe they don't have a nonprofit that's there that speaks their language, or maybe they don't have a person who speaks their language or has it's from their country as like this exemplar of what is possible. And really, I would say in terms of my coaching, of teachers, is getting teachers not to tell them what to think, but get them to reflect on what they do think about students, and, get them to create a pedagogy and a mindset that is aligned with the English Learner Roadmap, and, recognizes all the things we've talked about, like, that there's no one size fits all silver bullet, and that there's diverse multilingual profiles that need to be discovered through both quantitative and qualitative data. And it's a reflection tool that can be specific to like a project, but really it's just a way to think about serving a population that by very definition is going to be ever changing, right? Because I had a map in my classroom where the students would put a pin in from their country and their city when, as they arrived. And it was crazy because, we're here in Modesto, California. Not a lot of people, know about us. I wouldn't think we were like this international, destination. But my colleague and I looked at the mirror one day and we were like, wow, we are like here in Modesto, like a mirror of international events, right? We were able to look at the map one day and say, something's going on in Yemen, because we're getting all these kids, and for whatever reason, it's not on our news, and there was reasons, that with our allies and what was going on there, that it wasn't on our news, but we knew in our classrooms that something was going on there, right? And so like, how do we engage teacher leaders to be that voice, the front lines, like before the data reports at the end of the year that just say the bare minimum, right? They say like US school entry day, like, what language the student speaks. That's all data that is needed. But like, teachers are like that qualitative storytellers that can help make the education system be more proactive rather than reactive. So that's something that I like to do, both with coaching teachers and then also at the systems level, like master schedules and policies that can do that, right? Be proactive rather than reactive.
Yeah, no. And again, like all the moving parts, because if you want teachers to be those voices or to be an ally in that work, right, at that level, they have to be aware that they can, and then B, like giving them the resources and frankly some like the time to really give us that data, give us that narrative, because I think that's what you're speaking of, right? Is that narrative, that story, that insight of, ooh, I feel this thing based on the interactions that I've had in my classroom for the last 6 months, 8 months, whatever the case is.
Yep.
It's phenomenal.
I was just going to say time. You hit the nail on the head with time, because I mean, we give our teachers stipends, we give them a grant for project implementation. So I know a lot of times we think money, and money is good, right? Funding is important, budgets show priorities, all those things. But the most successful change agent projects that have really closed gaps for students in schools has been when teachers are given the gift of time. Collaboration time during the day, PLC time, paid time after school to do the work above and beyond the like that right there, I think is a true investment in teacher leadership. Like you can pay teacher leadership lip service, but if you want to see a school or a district that really believes in it, they're giving them time to do the work we just talked about.
You mean not a meeting that can be an email? Is that
I know,
is that what
it's
you mean?
revolutionary. I know. This is why I'm a rebel.
No, it's good. It's good. So Lindsey, we come up towards the end of the show, and I always ask the one question, like the one question I know I'm going to ask every time. And so you may have already talked about it, right? Which is fine. So if you want to reiterate it, or maybe answer it in a different way. So the big premise of the show is like under the hat is like what's top of mind right now, right? So like kind of based on what you've seen through your career, but also like maybe your vantage point right now is a little different than what it was when you're in the classroom. So the big question is like based on what you're seeing, based on like the work that you're doing, what is top of mind? What is something that is resonating with you, maybe keeping you up at night, but also like, okay, be fair, maybe there's some levels of success here in this work.
I'm in the spirit of the top of mind, I'm just gonna go with the first thing that popped into my mind when you pose that question. And I would say this, we know that the budget for California isn't rosy. And we know that in some cases at the local level, districts could potentially be coming up upon a fiscal crisis. So I'd say during and after the pandemic, we had this influx of money, right, from the federal and the state level to where we were able to attempt to address some of the equity gaps that the pandemic just put this super big spotlight on, right? And so now the money has dried up. The budget isn't rosy. That doesn't mean that the needs have gone away. And I just would love to really encourage everyone to remember that when you have to tighten the fiscal belt, first of all, budgets are a political process. So in California, get involved in giving your voice through the LCAP process, because if you think about the fact that budgets are a political process, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And if you're an advocate for multilingual students and families, and, some are able to plug in and are able to articulate what their students need, either in English or through the use of translators. Not everyone has not only that ability, but also, that cultural capacity to do that. Like, for example, I had a lot of families that were telling me in my country, it would be considered rude to go to a meeting and tell an educator what to do. They're the experts. Like, I would never be so insulting. I'm like, okay, but that it's different here, So keeping that in mind, like use your voice in the LCAP process at school board meetings, to advocate for multilingual students, but also don't let this fiscal cliff pit demographics against each other. That happened to me all the time. I'd be advocating for my multilingual students, and administrators or district leaders would talk about, well, if we give to you, then we're going to have to give to them. And first of all, whenever, the theys and the thems, it's like, we are not enemies here. We want to lift all boats. So, discover ways in which equity can be brought to specific students. In this case, I happen to be, an advocate for multilingual students, that isn't at the expense of another demographic, because it can be done. And a lot of those culture conversations we were having about mindsets, like if principle one, again, if the EL roadmap were to become the culture and the environment and the way people talked about students for English learners, it would benefit all demographics. So those are the changes we want. It shouldn't be us versus them. It shouldn't be, I'm going to take from you to give to this group. So top of mind with the budget situation being what it is, I would just encourage everybody to have an equity-minded focus that is not specific to one group, and to please, 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 as a teacher, as a parent, as a taxpayer, as a community member, get involved in all the ways in which you can be a change agent in your community, because the students who can't speak up for themselves are really counting on us to do that.
As a former government and economics teacher, yes to all that, all of that, and because that was always in my class. I'm getting feels here, like my time at Enox, but like, the putting the project-based learning and the design thinking in the heart of my class, and allowing my students to do more than just like memorize some stuff out of their textbook. Once they got into it, they're like, oh, this is hard. Like in terms of like actionable solutions, they're like, wait, this is why everything's all messed up. I was like, yeah.
Yeah.
this
It's
is
really
why...
easy to complain, but it's really hard to find solutions.
Right. Yeah. We really appreciate you, Lindsey, though. Like, cause I feel like I've just for myself maybe, but like, I feel like I've learned so much in terms of what is going on under the surface, right? Like, we have that image online that we see often of the iceberg, but then underneath, like you help to see a little bit of what's going on underneath, and seeing things that like we don't know they're there, right? Like like you're talking about like asylum seekers, you're talking about kind of the systemic problems that exist, the framework, the mindset, the culture. And so I, for one, really appreciate you spending the time with us and teaching us about kind of more of the good, the bad, and the ugly that exists within this work of supporting our English language learners. And so thank you. I really appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely my pleasure. I mean, I appreciate any opportunity I get to, talk about my experience and what I've learned by, supporting and advocating these students. And hopefully we'll be doing it for many more years.
Absolutely. Friends, we are coming up to the close here. For all of you that, and there's been plenty of you that have been supporting the show, supporting me and what I'm doing on the show. Again, feel free to, whenever you have time, go and visit underhatpod.com. That's where you can visit all the things, catch the episodes, all the social links, all that fun stuff. And continue to give those likes, subscriptions, all that stuff. And we're pretty booked in all the way through the month of May. The month of May, I am cutting it off. That'll wrap up season 1. It looks like we'll have something of 24, 26 episodes for the first season, which I'm thrilled about. And season 2 will start in the fall. For those that are watching live, and for those that will catch me at Spring Q, I will be at Spring Q starting tomorrow and be there through the weekend. I'm running a couple of sessions, and I will be in the exhibitor hall with my company and having fun there. But friends, thank you once again. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday evening. And as always, keep your hats on, but your minds open. Appreciate all of you. Have a good evening.